Dennis M. Harley, born in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, New York. Parents were Vincent Gerard Harley and Agnes Forbes Harley. My earliest living memory would be on top of a building, a roof of a building, overlooking a wide open area, and I believe it was in Quebec, Canada. I don't know how old I was, but certainly probably 3 or 4 years old, and I don't remember the trip, but I remember that, and I know years later confirmed with my mother that that's something I had recalled. I assume my parents and my sister, who was older than me. Actually, two. Well, I remember I lived before the house. The first place I remember would be a place called Flagg Court, Flagg Court. And Mr. Flagg was some sort of a real estate developer in New York and in Brooklyn. And that was a very well-known architectural type apartment building in New York. And I lived there. There was a central courtyard. I think there was 4 different towers. And we lived on the left-hand side, the first tower on the left-hand side. And I would have lived there. Well, certainly I was born in August of 45, and I definitely would have lived there until, I'm not sure, 1950 or so. And then the next house was a house in Rumson, New Jersey, which my father purchased, and we lived there for 1 year. And he commuted from New York. And then the next house, which was the last house in Brooklyn, would be 37 80th Street, which we entered my first year there. I went to kindergarten in Rumson. So my first year of grade school in Brooklyn I lived at 37 80th Street until I left. First through 8th grade, but the house at the end of my 9th grade of my first year of high school, I left and moved to Nevada. Yeah, I did, but didn't have much contact with them. My grandfather built a house during the Depression. He was a police officer, a sergeant with the New York Police Department. He built this house during the Depression, I believe as early as 28, certainly 29. And it was a house with a common stone entrance, and then it separated into 2 houses, but the outside looked like one house. And there'll be my grandfather lived in the left side, and in the right side, I don't know if he had tenants, but during my childhood, I had at various times various uncles who, after World War II, moved in there. I think the wives actually moved in during the war. My Uncle Thomas, he was in the war early, so probably around 1940. And then he came home in 45. And I know for certain his wife and children lived in that house with other relatives. Um, I remember playing with my sister, my oldest sister, when we lived at Flag Court. And, we were all together. When I remember when my brothers were born, and then my sister, and then my youngest sister. So I certainly remember them, but I for my youngest sister, Sheila, she was born in 1960, I believe. So 15 years difference. So I wouldn't have been playing with her, but and my the brother closest in age to me was born in 1950, Richard. Douglas was 1952. So no, I'd go to school with them in the morning. My mother would drop us off, or if I was an altar boy, so a lot of times I had to go early. I walked to school, but we were together 24/7. Other than that, and my father had a summer home in Lake Mohawk, New Jersey. So I certainly remember them. But even then, my sister and I would be at the pool most of the day. But they were still young, and then as they got older, then they would be at the pool with us. But sports and stuff like that, no. I used to play a lot of roller hockey and swimming. And that was, at first, my sister was a swimmer also, but I think she gave it up. And of course, she was away at college for 4 years in there. She was born in 1942, October 42. So 3 years older. Well, this swimming was all summertime. I mean, that's what we did. We were on. My sister and I, my father was a member of this. I don't know what the legal structure of it was, but it was an Olympic size swimming pool, and I think it was called the Olympic Pool Swimming Association or something like that. It was on the shores of Lake Mohawk at one end, and it was a seasonal membership, so you would pay whatever the amount of money was at the beginning of the season, and then you had unlimited use of that. We both, at an early age, prior to that, my father, before he moved to New Jersey, he and my mother had a tradition of renting properties on the Jersey Shore. And one place I remember in particular, Red Bank, which is it's on the other side of the Atlantic, but it's on a river, and so it's not the Atlantic Ocean, but you can get there by water taxi today directly from downtown Manhattan to Red Bank, and we lived maybe 2-3 miles from Red Bank, and during that period they had some sort of a swim association there, and I know that my first medal for swimming was at the age of 5, and my sister, she was probably 8 at the time, and she also was in that same association. And we'd go to country clubs and all around Alpine, New Jersey, which I don't really remember, but I know that went to the Alpine Country Club and other of these private clubs, and I kept that up. She, I think, didn't keep it up, but I continued swimming all summer. So I'd have meets half the time there and at our pool, and the other half they would carpool us to wherever we were going to go in New Jersey. So that was my sport. In grade school, I got into roller hockey, which just it's hockey but roller skating, and I played a lot of that. The roller hockey rink was built originally so you could flood it in the wintertime for ice, but by the 50s when I was going there, they weren't doing that anymore. And it was just roller hockey. And it was literally less than a block from where I lived at 37 80th Street. So it was a quick get down there and do whatever and then come back. And of course, once I got into high school, then I couldn't do that as much because I had other high school stuff. Well, in the eighth grade, they had it was the inaugural year, and I believe it was called St. Francis High School in Brooklyn. And all of the Catholic elementary schools were invited to send a representative to St. Francis on a single day. And in order to get there, the school, had a lot of people apply, and I was one of them for the speech contest. But in order they had to winnow down the number of people. So you had to memorize something. And the first year, my only year in it, I had to memorize the Gettysburg Address. And so I was selected out of however many people applied. And then you had to write an original speech on a topic. And I'm sure there was a limit to it. And my father hired a speech coach at Brooklyn Prep, I think. No, Poly Prep in Brooklyn, which is a well-known, small, elite private school. And so I went there on the subway with a nun one Saturday, went there, and I think we went through 2 or 3 rounds, culminating in the final. And there was about, 10 of us on the stage, and I won. So they gave me that plaque. Well, because of that, when I was in high school, I got into, all through high school, I got into speech contests, debate, extemporaneous, things like that. And when I was in Nevada, I got selected to Boys State in Carson City, and they had a similar speech contest, and I won that. So that was primary. That took over the expense of the swimming. I mean, I was a pretty good swimmer, but in the off year, I mean, nowadays I'm sure they have team sporting events, but that was unknown in my memory in Brooklyn back in the 50s. So I did for a short period of time in high school. I joined the Knickerbocker Swim Club, which I think was in downtown Brooklyn, and there was a guy on that team who was older than me, who was on the Lake Mohawk swim team. He was a backstroke, and I only did it for like a semester, and then schoolwork became overwhelming. But his name was Jed Graff, and I remember because he got a bronze medal in the Rome Olympics, probably in this 1960 or whenever that was. And he was a member of both teams. I only knew him in that sense, but he was quite a bit older than me. And I used to see him. The lake was maybe 3.5 miles long. And this guy would be out there doing backstroke day after day after day. And, had no idea. I mean, I knew he was devoted, but then one day I picked up the paper and there he was. I don't have any, I know my father made that arrangement, and he helped me with the structure and the speech. And I'm sure my mother supported it, but I mean, I specifically know that he located this woman, and the school is actually a dividing line between Bay Ridge and the next community over, Diker Heights, and probably the school is in Diker Heights. But yeah, it's he definitely made the contact, and then I would take the bus up there and go to the coaching sessions and everything else. Oh yeah, sure, yeah. I I wasn't thinking of that at the time, but yeah, sure. Well, he was always in. He was always an entrepreneur. Um he prior to World War II, he and I think he was barely out of high school, and he used to or he organized dances, and I'm assuming dances, high school level kids, and I don't think it was just Catholic schools. I think it was public schools and Catholic schools. And anyway, he'd go and make an arrangement with a Foreign Legion Hall or American Legion Hall, anybody who had a hall, and he'd bring in the Cokes and do all that and sell tickets. And he did that. His primary contact, his primary work at the time, though, was he worked for a man, and I don't even know his first name, but Mr. Gallagher. And Mr. Gallagher was an immigrant from Ireland who came over well before the turn of the century. And I'm thinking 1880, 1890, something like that. And he built up a whole string of bars, restaurants, ranging from, my father used to say, he built his business a bucket of beer at a time. And, I didn't know what that meant. And I asked him, and he said, well, in that period, before the 30s, a person would go into a bar or send one of his kids into a bar, a neighborhood bar on a corner, and buy a bucket of beer. And the closest thing to the bucket was described to me as like a paint bucket, but a little bit smaller. And, go in and put a dime down and get beer, and then take it home and drink it. And then, clean out the bucket. And the next time you went in, bring your bucket in and everything else. And that's how he did it, that they didn't have cans of beer. Everything was coming out of a spigot. So if you wanted to have a drink of beer outside there, I don't even think they were bottling at the time, but maybe they were. But anyway, he did that, and he wound up with a whole series of restaurants. And at some point, certainly by the early 50s, my father was working for him. I don't know in what capacity. And Gallagher let it be known that he was going to retire. He had obviously amassed a fortune, and as a man from Ireland who was born on a farm, he aspired to be a farmer in the U.S., and he purchased a huge parcel of land in Virginia, near the University of Virginia, near Charlottesville. And he set out to raise Santa Gertrudis, I think it's Gertudes, Santa Gertrudis cattle. And we went down there two or three summers. The family was probably my sister, me, and Mr. Gallagher had, I don't know, 7 or 8 kids. And he operated this, and one of his sons, I think he was my age, so he probably one of the younger ones. Everybody in that family that I'm aware of he sent them to Georgetown in D.C. And he lived the life of a farmer until at some point, probably the early 50s, he was killed in a tractor accident. And tractor came back, and they didn't have roll bars on him in those days, and he was pinned by the wheel of the tractor, and he died. But somewhere in that period, my father started acquiring bars, and I'm almost positive that just about every bar that he had operating under the Harley's Corner name in different areas of Bay Ridge and Brooklyn, I'm pretty sure those came from Mr. He purchased them from Gallagher. And then at one point he purchased about a 5-story building in downtown Brooklyn that he operated as a upscale restaurant and a catering hall for weddings, because in those days people lived in apartments or small houses. They didn't have room for parties. So American Legion halls and all that they could rent out, or even more upscale, they would go to a hotel. Well, his restaurant competed with hotels and provided, and he'd do 2, 3, 4 weddings on a Saturday. And that was a interesting business for him. But through that, he always wanted to purchase the property. So he got a real estate license. He got an insurance license. And he actually worked, after he had started acquiring parcels, he went to work certainly by the mid to late 50s. He worked for a real estate firm on Wall Street and worked out of the office for 2 or 3 years, I'm assuming, trying to learn the real estate end of non-restaurants and bars. But he always believed, buy the dirt, because you wanted to protect yourself. If you did good, you did good both ways. You owned the property, and then the rent was going to be stable. And if you didn't do good, you didn't have to worry about making the mortgage payment. So he did that, things like that. And that led him into other entrepreneurial type things. Dog racing in Venezuela. And that, I think he did that through a connection with Nelson Rockefeller, who was a big investor in Venezuela at the time. Persian rugs, just a myriad of things. And then the casino business in Nevada. No, not really. He wasn't home a lot, but he would be working. I mean, when I got up for school in the morning, or we got up for school in the morning, very, very rarely would he be awake. He'd be sleeping, because another thing he liked to do was one of his lessons to me was you always wanted to be there, unannounced. And he couldn't go to close out every night at every bar and every restaurant, but you wanted to pop in and close out every night just to see what's going on and everything else, and be there for the count. That, I think, was something that just caused him to do that. But anyway, he would always be asleep, and by the time I got home from school, he was gone. So and they only had one car, and at first he would take the car, but then as my mother needed the car to take kids to school, he would just take the bus or the subway or whatever, wherever he was going to go. She was a stay-at-home. She stayed at home until I think she went back to work when she was in San Francisco. After my father was ill, probably she went back to work, I think, first at Crocker Bank, 10 years down in the vault, clipping coupons. And then she left there and went to Macy's in their vault. And that was all same kind of a thing, clipping coupons or bills of whatever they call it, negotiable trade instruments, which were guaranteeing that the goods sent there would be paid for by Macy's, whatever. And she did that for another 10 years, I think. The relationship was good, but at some point, he when he was in Reno, I don't think she was really. I don't think she was really sold on that whole thing. But in reality, we came out, we left Brooklyn on a trip in the summer of 1959, and looking back, that trip obviously he was looking at business opportunities in Reno, specifically casinos, bars. And, as an example, we spent the longest time there, which was only like 4 days maybe, but everywhere else would be one night, go, go, go. And that one would do. And time-wise, that was 59. By the following 13, 14 months later, he had already closed on the casino, restaurant, and bar. And so I don't know the exact dates when he closed, but I think that's when he went out there and kicked the tires and said, yeah, this is something I'm going to do. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure my mother, she was probably in shock. Whoa, what are you going to? And his intent was he thought he was going to do it and travel back and forth. But it quickly became apparent that he was building that business, and you needed to be there. If you needed to be there to count the till, you really needed to be there to count the till in a casino. And they were notorious for cheaters and employees, non-employees, people off the street. And then he had his first heart attack while he was there, and then I think in his lifetime he had 3 or 4 heart attacks. Then he had a stroke in 1968. Well, my mother, they were when I left in the Army, they were living in San Francisco, but then he went and he was treated at the VA hospital in San Francisco. And that's why I left Nevada to come to San Francisco. And then when I left in the service, he was there, but then eventually he went back to New York. So, they never got divorced, but they were certainly separated for years. But neither one of them wanted to push for a divorce. So. Yeah, my Uncle Joe, he lived in the Jamaica, and it goes by various names, but any trip from Kennedy Airport to Bay Ridge, you go right through Jamaica. It's on the left side. There's a Jamaica hospital there, and I just don't know if there's a bay there near the airport, which is Jamaica Bay. So somehow, but it's an old working class community, roots back to the Revolutionary War. As Bay Ridge has, the Battle of Brooklyn went right through there. But my Uncle Joe was a policeman. He was older than my father. He lived in Jamaica. I saw him at various times, always in connection with a visit to, the first time, but I didn't see him on that particular day. He had a son, Joe Jr., who was horribly burned as a young boy, playing with matches and ink cans and such. And he was at Coney Island Hospital. And I remember a very, very warm day, and my father left my sister and I in a car, and my mother and father left for, seemed to me, a period of time, and my father was just terrible mood and outraged because he had just seen the pain that Joe Jr. was under in the hospital. And I remember him turning
to us, to my sister and I in the back seat, and saying something like, "Don't you ever play with matches or whatever?" But several times I remember going to my Uncle Joe's house, I think like on a Sunday afternoon, with my sister, who was about the same age as my cousin Arlene, and she was definitely in high school at the time, and we'd visit with the family. I don't think we had dinner or anything like that, but we'd visit with them. Very infrequent contact with him, maybe twice. With another notable exception, one day later in grade school, I was at home, and as I walked up the hill to our house, I was coming home from school. I saw two people, and the front door opened, and they went in. So I went around the back door, which we were leaving the house or go. We always went through the back door. And I went in there, and my mother was there, and she introduced Joe, because I think I knew who he was. And he was accompanied by another uncle, Frank Nolan. He was married to the only sister that they all had. It was all boys, and Cecilia Nolan, his mother. And they had just been at some law enforcement picnic over in, I believe, in Staten Island. And so the Staten Island ferry in those days came to 69th Street, and my grandfather's house, Bergen Place, would be, if there was a street, 67, it would have been about 67th Street. In any event, they decided to come by the house, and they all had a beer with my mother, and then they left. And I believe that night is the night that my Uncle Frank died. And I remember that distinctly. So I remember that of Joe. Keep in mind that Joe Harley left. He left New York probably 57, 58, something like that. He retired, and he took a job on the West Coast, based in LA, he was the West Coast security chief for American Airlines. And so I had more contact with him in later years. And I do remember him visiting when my mother was in San Francisco and I was in San Francisco. I remember several interchanges with him in a car where I was driving him from our house to the hotel where he was staying in downtown San Francisco, and going into things, and he'd answer questions. And he came to Reno on a couple of occasions, and he may have come to Reno. I think he came to Reno, and my father wasn't there, and he knew he wasn't there, but he was coming for business for American Airlines. He used to go to his jurisdiction, I know, went into Arizona. And so I had more contact with him, substantive discussions with him about life and family history and stuff like that. My Uncle Tom, I don't think I ever met him until he was living in Fresno, and that would have been 1959. We stopped in Fresno. I think that's the first time I ever met him. And Blanche, I had a contact with the boys, some of them at least, but Patrick and Tommy Harley. I was in that area one time, and frankly didn't know that my grandfather built this house and that they lived there. And I was with some other guys. I don't know what we were doing. And anyway, I was outside my jurisdiction, so to speak. And they were, "Hey, what are you guys doing here?" And somebody said, "Hey, what's your name?" I said, "Harley." And they're like, "What do you mean Harley?" "Yeah, Harley." And one of them probably Tommy ran into the house, and I think it was my aunt Ginger came out. She's, yeah, what are you doing here? Yeah, that's your cousin or something like that, which I remember that, but no contact. Yep. My grandmother, when she moved out of Bergen Place, they sold it, I guess. And when she moved out, she lived with the Nolans in Pelham. I don't know if she lived only in Pelham, but he bought a beautiful house up in Pelham uh, once he was in private practice and left the FBI. And while in Pelham, we at least two years in a row on Mother's Day, we would go up there, play around the house with them, the huge estate, and then we'd all go in cars to some nice restaurant, and my grandmother would be there. And the only other interaction I'd ever had with her was she came one time for 3-4 days a week to Rumson. And I remember her, helping her pick apples and from an apple tree in the backyard. And then she made an apple pie. I guess it was the first time I ever had apple pie or fresh apple pie. It was delicious. But she had my recollection of my slight interaction with her, she had a bit of a brogue at times. And she was one to, say, now lad, don't do, when you put the shovel, she didn't call it a shovel, a spade. You put the spade down. You always put it this way. You don't want it going this way. You step on it, it'll hit you in the head with a handle, stuff like that. But no real contact. And then she moved out, and when my aunt moved out to Burbank, and I think 1955 is why she died. She had diagnosed with cancer, stomach cancer, and everybody, all the children, gathered. There's a great picture of them all in the Burbank living room, and that was in connection with her death. But no, very little contact. Now, Tom Harley, I had a lot of contact with because he was working for my father in Reno as a shift manager for a while. I think 2, maybe 3 years. And so we would have conversations. And I know I repeated once some of the war stories he told, and Tommy and Patrick were, well, not so much Patrick, but Tommy was, and Kevin were, beside themselves that, here they had been Marines and everything else, said their father never said a word to them. So I was the one telling them, well, yeah, how he got injured and everything else. It was based solely upon what he was telling me. And that was just one time sitting on a staircase inside a doorway above the casino where we lived. But other than that, no, there wasn't much contact. Everybody was working there. Frank Nolan was doing his investigative political security investigation business, and the women were all working at home. And no, some of them, I'm not sure, but my mother's sister, she would come out periodically. Oh, and my Uncle Joe did come to Lake Mohawk once, and so did Arlene. I remember that because my uncle and I assume his wife was there. But anyway, they all went to dinner or something, and Arlene was in charge, and somebody heard a noise, whatever. Arlene took out she says, I have a weapon. And it was a sap. I don't think they use them anymore, but cops used to carry them in their back pocket. It was basically a leaded leather pouch, and you could put your hand there, you wouldn't lose it, whap somebody on the neck or the head or wherever. But no, we were pretty separated. My father, I don't know that he had a favorite. He rarely drank. And I know he would bring in wooden crates of bottles of Coca-Cola, ginger ale for the holidays. And the holidays were Thanksgiving and Christmas. Mother's Day, I don't know where we were, but I don't have any recollection. But Thanksgiving and Christmas was full bore at our house. And my aunt, my mother's, would be there. Her father was alive at the time. He would be there with his second wife. And I remember that. I'm sure I have no recollection of him drinking specific, on that, but I'm sure he would have a drink. But typically that would be the only time you'd ever see him with a drink. And I remember one time being in the casino, and they used to serve the drinks, and he told somebody, maybe it was my Uncle Tom, and he said, because everybody says, "Oh, I want to buy you a drink." So he would turn to the bartender and go like that, and the bartender knew, don't give him a full pour, put a light pour, put in something, and then when he served the glass, they would have a cocktail napkin with a rubber band around it, so that nobody could tell how weak it was, and that was to go. But when he did drink, you'll be totally surprised that I know in the Reno days, the call would be for his drink, Dewar's and water. And my mother, yes, I certainly recall times, not necessarily as a child, but I certainly remember the times when she would drink another blended scotch, and now I can't remember the name of it, Chivas Regal. She would drink Chivas Regal. She would drink beer all year round, but in particular, summers in Lake Mohawk, she'd have 2 big cans of beer, and she'd be cooking and having her beers. But I can only recall going out and having, other than those Mother's Day things, my mother would go out with us probably every Friday night in grade school, and that was because Catholics couldn't eat meat. And so I was raised on pasta with olive oil, pasta with butter, pasta with cheese or whatever, but no meat. And my father would never attend any of those. He was working wherever he was. But she would drink Chivas, and that's a later life type of thing. But when they were having a Christmas party or something, I'm sure they were drinking. But I know everybody else was, so I don't know why they wouldn't. But my father was not a drinker. I don't think my mother was either, but she drank beer every day. And I think the reason he was not a drinker, and all my uncles, as far as I know, Tom, Joe, my father, they weren't drinkers. And I think it goes back to their father, because I'm told that their father was a, quote, he was alcoholic, but there was a phrase, something like, he doesn't show it. He doesn't fall down drunk. He doesn't slur his words. He shows up for work every morning, but he's drinking too much. And he used to, stories I was told, he would have his cop friends over, and they'd be in uniform, and they'd sit down on a couch and in his living room, and he'd pay one of my uncles to go get 2-3 buckets of beer, and they'd bring it down there, and these guys would unloosen their tunics and those big old woolen uniforms, and then their gun belts. So the gun would be there beside them, but not on their waist, and they'd sit there and have a great old time. And then I was a witness to a conversation that I don't know if it was my Uncle Joe and my father or my Uncle Tom and my father, but I distinctly remember the conversation. where he would come home, my grandfather, and he would walk into he'd change, put on, take off his uniform, and then he'd be shining his shoes. And my grandmother said, "And where are you going?" And he goes, "Where the hell do you think I'm going? I'm going out with the lads," or something like that. And that is what I remember hearing. And then one of them saying, he was an alkie, he had a problem. And, well, maybe or something. And another thing that I just remembered is when he died, they had the wake, as was the custom, the wake. So he was in the coffin in the living room, and people would come and, the night before or whatever. And my father, it was January 1945. So my father was in the Merchant Marine, and I think he was in New York, or port of New York. He sailed out of New York and went to Europe. And so he must have been around, because he walked in, and when he went there to the house, my Uncle John was there, who was a doctor in the medical corps, but he was there. And so Joe, my father, and I guess it was John. And anyway, somebody's reached up on the cabinet to get the whiskey bottle out, and John and what was described to me, he said, no booze, like that. And I took that to mean, that had been a problem, and he didn't want my grandmother to have to suffer through a bunch of louts getting sauced. But yeah, that's what I remember about that. Oh yeah, she cooked every night. I don't, other than the Friday things in, that was always in Bay Ridge. So that was, winter, spring, whatever. But we would the schedule in those days for Lake Mohawk would be probably towards the end of June, school would get out, and always the day after Labor Day. So we would come home probably Sunday of Labor Day weekend to get the house. In those days, the house, my father would be the only person coming in and out of the house. And one year my father was going somewhere, and he hired my Uncle Pat. I call him Uncle Pat. It's my father's uncle. And he was an alkie. And I remember going down, we had a finished basement toy chest, and opening up the toy chest, and the little Dewar's again, little half pints of Dewar's. And I remember my mother said, "Oh, don't touch that, like that." And then she picked up, filling a trash bag full of these liquor bottles. Well, he'd been there maybe 6 weeks, and I guess he'd just go, and instead of putting them in the trash, he'd hide them. And I remember her commenting, the small half pint, well, you think he'd buy a bottle, for crying out loud, or what do you get all these little glasses and stuff? But yeah, that was what did she cook? She cooked everything. I've told Rose this, and maybe the kids. She cooked 7 days a week for all of us, and my memory is several liver and onions, and I sat one time. Let's say dinner was at 6:00. I sat there till about 11:30 at night, refusing to eat that. And the command was, you can't leave that table until you eat. Well, I was allowed to go pee, but other than that, I just sat there. And she even turned the light off in the kitchen, and sitting and nope, okay, and never said another word, but never served me liver and onions ever again. But my recollection, food, potatoes. I mean, baked potato. I think I had baked potato probably 3-4 nights a week. Meat, some chicken, She made a veal parmigiana, which became, my welcome home meal was always, here, I made your favorite. I got you American cheese sandwiches and veal parmigiana. But yeah, she cooked everything. I don't- I was fine with the food until she gave me that liver and onions. Summertime, same routine, but no Friday thing. And then what we would do is barbecue. We barbecued. And I don't know what we did on a Friday night. I don't even remember if there was a pizza parlor anywhere around us in those days. But I was unless my father was there, I was the barbecue guy. So to have the old barbecue in the back, and hamburgers, hot dogs, and then whatever she was cooking. She, I mean, I have images of her, me coming in and out of the barbecue, whatever, and she's in the kitchen making, and her screen window over the sink, she could see me on the other side cooking on the barbecue. But uh, well, I assume my father told my mother, I'm going to take him to Reno. And I had nothing else, although I know now, 50, 60 years later, I know that my mother, I don't think she ever said this to me, but people have told me that she said that was the worst decision, or the worst thing I ever did was letting him take him. But at the time, I did. Of course, I had I wasn't. Nowadays, if you said to me, "Oh, I want your son to go to live in Seattle with you go, whoa, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense." Yeah, the only analogy to that, of course, would be my Uncle Joe, when his father took him from his mother and family, and he was in Ireland for 3 or 4 years, no education, and then brought back. And my grandfather said, "Okay, what are we going to do with him now? He's back here. He had no education. I mean, I think he went before they took him over. So he probably had 3, 4 years of education here and nothing over there. And he was way out. They say we're from Ballyhonus, which is a town, but this place is probably no more than 4 or 5 miles from Ballyhonus, but in the middle of nowhere. I mean, there's no. The only way you would get to Ballyhonus would be walk, and that wasn't something I'm sure he did. So I never really talked to him about that whole Irish sojourn, except that he was a firm believer in the leprechauns. And it came back to an actual story. And I remember one of the boys telling me that, and I repeated it in his presence. I said, "What is this? They're telling me you believe in leprechauns and the banshees and all these other things." And he let me know right away. Yes, and don't you was okay, we'll leave it there. And the other thing I remember now is when he was over there, and I don't know how old he was, but all his life he had a depression behind his right ear. And he was hit. The British brought in literally a bunch of criminals. They got people, army veterans, but who had been convicted of various crimes, took them out of the prisons, and they gave them militia uniforms, we'd call them. And they called them the blacks and the tans, black boots and like a tan outfit. And during the Civil War period, they were around, and prior to the British used them to get out there in the boonies. And one day he said something that one of these guys didn't like, and he hit him with a butt stroke on his rifle and broke, I think it was the mastoid bone. And apparently at the time, that was a fairly common surgery, at least in Ireland, mastoid surgery, and it would leave a terrible scar and everything else. Well, he had not so much the scar, but he had the depression, and people thought he had mastoid surgery. And I don't think he did. I think it was just that butt stroke. But I mean, I've been there to the old house, the ruins. All it is a foundation, and it's like it was pouring rain during the day, and you looked around, you couldn't see anything. I mean, it was just like, whoa. I was, hey, this is nice. Um, I got registered in high school. I got a job. My father always wanted me working, so I got a job. It was the first job I ever had for a paycheck. KDOT radio, KDOT, and it was a news station. It was a pretty popular station, but they were tenants of my father in the building, the casino building. And on the north side, when he bought it, there was a restaurant, bar, and then on the other side of that, there were staircases going up to these small offices where they were, and the other side was staircase going up in which they had living quarters for the lady he was renting the building from. And and I remember going there, and the night of the Kennedy election, ripping. They had, in those days, I think they had at least 2 news services, teletypes, and the teletype machine was outside the studio, because the studio had to be quiet. So the guy would be in there, and they always had the radio playing outside, so you knew where he was. I mean, what he was saying and what was coming up. Sometimes, because there was a timesheet, they had to do this, do that with them. And at 9:11, you got to hit the button or say something live about the Ford dealer or whoever was buying the time. Anyway, so my job on election night was just not even reading it, just go to there, pull it off, and anything having to do with the election, put it in order, in chronological order, take it off in chronological order, and then go in, stand outside the door until I made eye contact with the announcer, and he'd go, come in, and then hand him the 2 stacks or whatever it was. And I remember that. And then I did that for 2 years. I wasn't doing it by my senior year. No, above the casino. The casino was a tenant of this woman who she and her husband bought the building. The building was pretty old. I think they bought it, and then they had tenants: the casino, the restaurant, the bar, probably the radio station, anybody there. And then when you went up the staircase, there were 3 apartments on the left, and I think 3 or 4 on the other side. And she lived in a big one. Oh, that's why. Yeah. On her side of the building, and they fixed it up her husband was still alive. So on our side, it was 2 separate apartments. And my father eventually took down the glass door in the hallway, put up a security door, and then my Uncle Tom lived in one, still had a glass door, and he and I lived in the other one. And on her side, that was all one big apartment. She would have me over for, Sunday dinner pretty often. I would say once a month at least. The landlord, Mrs. I want to say Liverato. I remember she had a she was German. She must have been Greek, but Liverato, I think, was German. And when I was in high school, I knew that one of her nephews, George, last name Greek, and I remember it was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and I had worked at the radio station, so at some point I got a not a portable one, but a plug-in radio, and I would have it on a lot, and I had the plug-in radio on, and I heard, and they mentioned the brother of the guy I knew, George, his brother, who was the oldest nephew of the landlord. He was a lawyer, and he was trying a divorce case in the main courthouse on Virginia Street, and the husband took out a gun and killed him. And I remember that, every time I hear about a shooting or violence in a courtroom, I always think about him the day before Thanksgiving, and in the courtroom. Yeah. And in subsequent years later, I was long gone, but I remember there was a guy, I forget his name. He was a quirky political type. Anyway, he became a judge. I think he was the mayor of Reno for a while, and then he became a judge. He was in his chambers, same courthouse, and his window faced on Virginia Street. And the bad guy was in a parking garage across the street, took a rifle and shot through the window, I think once or twice, but missed the judge. But they traced him down or something. Ultimately, probably not, because he used to think, he obviously, said, you have to be a fool to lose money in this business. I mean, how could you lose? But it was everybody. If you were an employer in an established casino, they're all right there most of them all on this one street, and some of them dated back. I think the first one ever was Harold's Club in the 1932, when casino gambling became legal in Nevada. If you had a thief, if you caught a manager, a dealer cheating or whatever, they wouldn't report that to anybody. The reason is they didn't want the word to go out that, we're so stupid, we got taken advantage of. And plus, they got the added thing, they don't say anything. Let the guy leave. He goes and he applies and he goes to work for their competitor across the street. Let him steal from him. Yeah, something like that. But no, it is a very, very strong business. He was competing. The biggest operator of Harold's Club was Bill Harrah. He had Harrah's Club there. He had Harrah's Club up in Tahoe, and he definitely had one of the smaller casinos on the main strip. And I think, probably that's what caused the problem, in addition to the theft. But yeah, it just didn't work. But he wasn't able to do much about it because he got sick, and he was in Washoe, St. Mary's Hospital, I think it's called, in Washoe County. He was there and he had the heart attack, and I think he had one or two after that. And, I don't think he did much. Clearly, he knew he had a heart attack, but I don't think he did much about his lifestyle to, he'd start working out. He may have still, I don't remember, he may have still been smoking, stress. Yeah. And ultimately, that's what happened. He had a stroke, and then he had another stroke when he was on the operating table to repair his carotid artery. So he didn't have a good history there, but neither he nor my mother really, my mother, I'm sure she never exercised